Hey everybody, John at IPT Trans. Today we're working on a Toyota Supra A340. This is how we do the pump. Time and where bolts come out. What we're going to look at is a stator support to make sure there's no twist on the splines. There's no wear in this area. If you have any wear that you could catch a fingernail on, then this thing's a paperweight. You got to throw it out. So you know, maybe like 5,000 scoring is kind of too much. A little bit less than that's okay. Check the bushing in the rear, bushing in the front. Want to make sure this is tight when you move it back and forth. If it isn't, it's not only going to cause an alignment problem and possibly have the drum touch down on these sealing rings, your converter apply oil can leak down through this bushing and cause a converter shutter. So it's pretty critical that these two bushings are in good shape, or you change them if they're not. Sealing rings you're always going to replace, so you can take them off at this point. If you see they're scarf cut, the ends have to go together like this. Now, this is a crescent style pump. This is what's referred to as the crescent. The main thing that goes wrong with these is this gear misaligns and these gear teeth walk into the crescent. This one you can see a little bit of touching, but it's not bad. This is fine. It's not substantial scoring or anything like that. Outer gear, we're going to look at the outside diameter for scoring, which is fairly common, especially if you have a failure in the trans that's involved a lot of metal. And the same rule of thumb, if you could catch a fingernail on it, it's no good. So this one is alright. We're also going to check the outside diameter of where it rides for scoring. This is also fine. The front seal. And that's going to enable us to take a look at the pump bushing. Pump bushings we almost always change. But you're also going to look for scoring and you know, just anything out of the ordinary. And you're going to need a bushing driver to remove it. This will give you a little bit better look at what you're dealing with in there. You see this one got a little blue from heat. O-ring on the outside diameter. Take off. Then we put this all aside to clean it up and reassemble it. Alright, now we're going to cover the Sprags in this unit. They're something people ask about a lot. There's a lot of problems with them. First of all, Sprag rotation. You got to put these back in the right way or you're going to have all kinds of issues. So when you put this together, this is your low Sprag. It's got to rotate counterclockwise and it locks clockwise. Alright, you always have to make sure it works that way. Your intermediate Sprag for second gear, if you're holding it like that, it's going to rotate clockwise and lock counterclockwise. Your overdrive Sprague, it's together correctly, holding it like this, it's going to rotate counterclockwise and lock clockwise. Now with these Sprags, it's hard to see from this angle, but they're called the dog bone element Sprag. And what they're designed to do is freewheel in one direction and lock in the other. With a lot of power, these things can roll over, so you want to do everything possible to keep them from breaking, and some surface preparation goes a long way.
What causes them to roll over? I'll edit this part out.
Just power.
There's nothing.
Yeah, I'll
specific.
get a better picture of what it looks like. And we'll just, I'll take two of them over to the lathe and we'll spin them. Okay. On your low Sprague, there's a snap ring that retains it. Okay, there's a snap ring that retains this. The top washer. Sprague itself. Sometimes you have to pry up a little bit, especially if it's dirty. You'll notice on here there's a little retainer, okay, and this has to face in this direction. You see it's a tab that faces up. So you just think of it as that tab keeping it from coming up out of the planetary. We have another washer underneath. And then a plastic washer. The intermediate Sprague's pretty much captured. So if you want to change this, you're going to have to pop this retainer off, change the element, and then pop it back on. But you have to be real careful not to bend this because it's not going to sit on there right when you're done. Overdrive Sprague is pretty much the same deal. Snap ring retains it. We have a metal plate, brass washer, and Sprague element. And we also have the same thing, protruding tab. On some of these there's also a removable Sprague outer race. Oops. And there's a washer underneath here. Okay, and you also have to be careful because on some of these models these pins can fall out. Like essentially your washer is what holds them in. So if you're washing it or anything like that, make sure those inner pins stay in there or you're going to have all kinds of problems. It's going to melt the planetary when you put it back together. Alright, it's good to prepare the surface that the Sprague rides on a little bit. You don't want it too smooth. And obviously you could do this by hand, but if you have a lathe or some way to spin it, it's a little bit easier. And obviously if you're using a lathe, you got to be pretty careful doing this. Basically, we just want to rough it up a little bit to give the Sprague something to bite into a little bit. We're going to do the same with the inner race for the low Sprague. I don't want to go through this for every drum, but I'm going to show you guys how to compress the return spring. This is for the intermediate clutch. For this you kind of need to make a little tool. This is made out of a bushing out of like a Ford Taurus trans or something like that, because you have 4 protrusions here that are kind of hard to get around. So you're going to Lay that on there. Compress the spring. And remove the snap ring pliers. On this particular piston, they're a little difficult to get out, but we came up with a little trick here. We got our air apply hole. Some people try and pump air and blow them out, but that doesn't work because you got to kind of center it. So if you just use it back and forth, you have that piston almost out. And it's an easy matter to get it out the rest of the way. And of course, we're going to change these seals. Essentially, every time you're working on the trans, you really have to do a lot of washing, and all this muck gets in here, and that'll, you know, when you get new fluid in there, it's just going to cut loose and clog up the valve body. So what we like to do is hand wash everything until it's perfectly clean, and then we throw it in this big parts washer, which is kind of a 180-degree dishwasher, which is going to really get everything super clean that you could probably eat off of it when it's done. Alright, we're going to get a note on inspecting these Torrington bearings. As close up as we get, this thing looks fine, but a lot of times what you're going to see on the race that it mates to, the metal is starting to pit away, which obviously this whole thing has to get replaced. And when these bearings fail, it really is going to make a giant mess in the trans. So any kind of lack of smooth, this one's very bad, but sometimes it's just a little tiny pit. It's got to get replaced.
Cool.
Okay. Sometimes people are asking how to get these neutral switches off. One of the problems you run into is that this shaft rusts onto the switch. If the switch is still good, what you can do is remove the whole shaft from inside of the transmission and just leave everything on there so you don't break anything. If you want to take the switch itself off, you need to change it, or it looks like it's going to be easy. First thing you have to do is bend these tabs up, usually 4 or 5 of them. And this nut usually isn't too tight. So yeah, 24 millimeter. Obviously the retainer sits underneath it. This 12 millimeter has to come out. When you put this back on, you want to kind of look for witness mark where the old thing was positioned exactly, because otherwise it'd give you problems like maybe not starting in neutral or things like that. And you want to try and gently pry it off. If this gives you any kind of trouble, it's going to break coming off, so what you have to do is take the whole shaft off. Which we're not going to take this one out because I could change this seal and this seal while leaving it in. But a little trick, if you do have to take it apart, is drill right into where it's staked. And then we can move this collar out of the way. Kill it. Move the collar out of the way, and we have access to this roll pin, which we could drive through to here. Then this whole shaft will come right out. Right, another quick note is these accumulator pistons have rubber O-rings on them, and they like to go flat. So you want to prep up these surfaces where they sit a little bit. And they have a couple different ways to do it. This is called a bore buddy, made by Superior, which is one way. Or this, I believe you get from Mac Tools, and what it is red Scotch-Brite. If you don't have anything like this, of course you could just get in there with some Scotch-Brite and do it by hand. But what you want to do is just like put a little crosshatch in it for the oil to sit in. So the oil sits between the bore and the rubber seal, and it kind of keeps it lubricated. Something else that's very important, which you would probably know if you had one of these machines, is when you get finished washing it, you got to get the soap out of there and rinse it out real well, because that'll also screw up the rubber seals in a hurry. Clean this out a little bit and kind of what it should look like when you have it done right. Okay, now we're going to address the third clutch drum. The clutches are out of it. Press the return spring. Remove the retaining snap ring. Spring retainer. And you're usually going to have to tap this on the bench to get the piston out. Okay, now going back together on the third clutch drum, obviously we cleaned everything up. In the rebuild kit, all the little sub kits are marked, forward and direct clutch pack. Direct is your third clutch. I'll take out the O-rings that we need. Place the inner one. And the outer. You're going to have different sizes in here, some of which you'll use and some of which you won't, but you got to put the ones that are going to fit on there. As assembly lube, we have a mixture of STP and trans fluid, roughly 50-50. This is usually the best stuff to put your pistons back in with. And you don't want to skip this. A lot of people just will bang a set of clutches in here, but you really need to change this rubber because sometimes it's damaged. And you just got to kind of ease these in here. Make sure it turns freely when it's in. Put our retainer back on. The snap ring. Then we take it over to the press. Compress it down. Either do this with pliers or by hand. Put your snap ring in, make sure it's seated. There we go. These little tabs have to be surrounding the snap ring. That's what keeps it from popping out. Alright, when these kits come from us, everything is packaged together. Just for the sake of convenience, I'm going to leave out the step of soaking the clutches. In an automatic transmission, you want to soak all the clutches for about 15 minutes. Then I hang them on here and let them dry off a little bit. Then I put the clutch packs together. Okay, so we have to alternate our clutch discs and our steel discs. The parts that come in this kit are probably going to be different than what you took out. We use thinner discs here so you could get more in here. So this is a 5-disc setup. Your original top pressure plate and snap ring are going to get used. Again, make sure everything's correctly seated. And you're probably going to want about 30 to 50 thousandths clutch clearance. When you're done, you're going to put your washer back on. The kit's going to give you new washers. Put some transmission grease on here so it's not going to fall off. And kind of glue the washer on with that. And that's it. That's your third clutch drum. Okay, now we're going to go back together with this pump. This bushing isn't included in the kit, but they're available. And you are going to need a bushing driver set to correctly install this. The bushing gets driven in until it's approximately flush, and then we're going to check it. We're going to put this down on the converter hub and make sure everything's nice and free. If it's tight, you really have to address it, or it's going to rip out once you start the engine up. Next, we're going to put our front seal in. And I like to use something flat to drive it in there perfectly straight and flush. Little assembly grease here. And on the bushing. I'm using this as a workstand. It's just a tool for another transmission. Use some more transmission assembly lube. And our gears. The gears you're going to put in the same way that you took them out, and if you get crossed up, you'll see the outer gear has a dot on it, which is going to face up. And on the inside, you could kind of see the wear mark where your torque converter hub was. So there's nothing touching there, and something was touching there. So that's the way it goes in. A little more transmission assembly lube, and the stator. This we have to line up correctly. We'll put our bolts in. We're going to want to torque these to 80 inch-pounds. Pump O-ring. Pretty simple stuff. Now we're going to open our sealing ring kit, and there's a bunch of different sizes. There's going to be, I believe, 5 that are about the same size. Now whenever you're working on a transmission, you want to make sure your sealing rings are correct for where you're putting them. So we do this by getting the drum that's going to sit here and putting the rings in and making sure they're the correct size. As we showed before, they're scarf cut and these have to sit like this. So what I like to do is give them a little twist together Kind of load up these grooves with transmission assembly grease. And try and do this so you can see it. Put them in overlapping. And these aren't like piston rings in an engine. They're going to turn where they want, so whether they're lined up or not does not matter. Kind of squeeze them in there a little bit, and then I put the part that's going to sit on there on the rings, and that kind of is going to size them. Now with enough grease, these are all going to stay held together for when you final assemble this thing. And lastly, we're just going to put some transmission assembly lube on the pump O-ring and the bearing race. Also held on with grease. And that's it, your pump is done. Next, we're going to move on to this next bag of parts marked Overdrive clutch pack. We really have two overdrive clutches. We have a overdrive direct and an overdrive brake, which sits in the center support. And this is just about the same as what we already did with the direct clutch. The only thing here is a whole bunch of different size sealing rings. You have to pick the right ones out. Typically you're using the larger ones on this overdrive brake. I like to stretch these out a little bit so they don't come out of the groove. We'll just cut that. It's kind of hard to do while you're like trying to make it visible.
We'll make it invisible.
Next, we're going to turn this over. Plastic washer that sits here. We also have a bearing race. This is going to be the one that's perfectly flat. And the same deal with these sealing rings. Moving on to the forward clutch drum. Same thing with the sealing rings. These are the three small ones in the kit. Kind of hard to miss. And we're going to kind of gently put them in here after we put our Torrington bearing on. You're also going to have to rotate this into the direct clutches as you're putting the drum down. It's easier said than done sometimes. Hear that nice clicking sound, you know you have it in right. Now we're going to take this back over to the press. Same as the last clutch drum. Press it down and install the snap ring. Next, we're going to put our forward clutch pack in. Some models take 5, some take 7, some take 6. This one is a Toyota Supra, so we're probably looking at the 7-disc clutch pack. Now we get our top pressure plate. And our snap ring. Clearance looks a little too loose, so we're going to have to address that by putting a different thickness steel plate in. Okay, as you notice, I'm putting this stuff back together as it goes back into the trans. It's just a more organized way of doing things. It's more space efficient, and it gives you 2 chances to get everything right when you're putting it back together. If there's a mistake, you'll see it as you're taking one part out and putting it back into the trans. Same deal with this. I'm going to spline this down into the clutches. And you're going to look for that nice solid sound, which means you don't have a clutch hung up and it's down all the way. And you guys are probably going to want to keep these bearings more organized than I do. You know, I kind of know where they go, and I could just pick them up out of a pile, but if you're doing these, you probably aren't doing these transes every day, so you want, you know, keep everything neat and maybe wire it together with mechanics wire, and you know, you don't want to make a mistake with a bearing because you're going to blow the thing up in about 2 blocks. Got a couple more rings that go on here. These are metal rings, and they hook together. I'm trying to give you a better view of that. When they're installed, you know, have them like that. Plastic washer. And our Sprague. One thing to note, as we discussed Sprague rotation before, you'll also notice that the Sprague has one short side and one deep side. And this deep side is always going to face up. Sometimes I like to find something that's going to sit on the retainer to press it down. That way it's not going to bend. This particular snap ring is kind of difficult on these units. You have to play with these to make sure they're all going to seat for you. Done this too many times, right? There's two lugs that look different. This only indexes in the case one way because your parking pawl has to sit in this window. Inside the case there's a corresponding spot that's only going to fit into. Oops. And sometimes you could just use your output shaft. Make sure that's seated correctly. Then we'll take this over to the press. You're not going to be able to see what I'm doing in there because it's... All right. First thing, we got to put our bearing in the case. I like to, if possible, put this whole setup in together because it's easier than trying to thread all this stuff together once it's down in there. Put it together and grab it with snap ring pliers. Now we got to put our low reverse clutches in. These steels only fit in a certain way. There's a thick pressure plate that goes to the bottom. No, you don't want to keep filming all this. Alright, after we get our last low reverse steel plate in, we're going to put our second clutch housing in. There's a hole. Obviously it's got to align with this hole. You just have to gently ease it in there. What helps sometimes is to get your sun gear, put it in, turn it. Sometimes your second clutch housing will drop right down. Once that's all in, you want to put your snap ring in, which you could sometimes do like this. Doesn't always work though. Squeeze it together. Put it in the case with the opening facing the bottom here. Now we're also going to get a couple little taps and make sure it's seated correctly. Our kit has a 6 clutch second gear setup. So sometimes we need to machine this spacer 20-30 thousandths to get the correct clearance. Alright, I like to put the Sprague in first. First steel plate. Then alternate clutches and steels. I'm going to put the thick pressure plate on top. And the snap ring. At this point, we're going to put our apply sleeve in, and we're going to air apply this to make sure we have hydraulic integrity in the back section of the trans before we go any further. Okay, this apply sleeve goes in here, rubber end facing towards the drum, and we could check our second clutch pack. As you see, there's no leakage. Check our low reverse clutch pack after we find the right hole. There we go. And that applies 100%. Next, we're going to put our sun gear in. Front planetary. So you're probably not going to be able to see it, but we're going to have to put our output shaft in and then put this clip on. Try and get a shot in here. Unlikely you're going to be able to see too much. Check to make sure that's seated correctly. Going in one piece. You grab this, try and do it gently so you don't bang up the splines or anything like that. Put our band in first. And that's the sound you're going to hear when it's fully seated. And the center support, you want to lube up the outside and real gentle putting it in because it's very, very tight in the case. And you want to make sure that your two bolt holes are going to line up correctly here. Now we have to install our bolts. After that's all the way down, I'm going to put our bolts in just loosely. At that point we get this large snapper in. You'll see there's a taper on it. This taper always sits the way I have it here. The snap ring has to index with the opening facing this hole, otherwise it interferes with the valve body getting put down. This overdrive clutch retainer is kind of difficult to install. You can do it on the bench or with the trans put together, which is the way I prefer to do it. Alright, I have some cut-off bolts that I use to put pumps in. You could do without it, but it just makes it a little bit easier. Obviously they only go in one way, so we have to line up the correct bolt holes. We should be able to push it in by hand. At this point we're going to tighten up the center support. Evenly. And we're going to air check our clutch packs. These two are a little less solid because they have sealing rings involved. Your overdrive should be 100%. After you get your pump bolted down, you want to make sure everything turns freely and that you have a little bit of unit end play. Alright, well, we got this thing all back together, other than the valve body, but there's another video on that, so there's no reason to go over it again. That's about all you need to do.
Please like, share, subscribe, and hit the notification bell.